Well, we pulled an old bait and switch here. It's a real old game
Mm-hmm.
trick. We thought we told you guys were gonna get a single presenter. You are getting 3 presenters right now.
Mm-hmm.
It is a talk on a degree in game design. Our 3 presenters. Your first one is Stephen Slota. Stephen is an assistant professor in residence in educational technology at Uconn with dual appointments to the NEAG School of Education Department of Educational Psychology and School of Fine Arts Department of Digital Media and Design. The research focuses on the relationship between play, storytelling, and learning, and they are currently working on a browser-based game called EOS 503 intended to help teach and assess pre- and in-service educator problem solving. They teach courses like game systems design, serious games, interactive storytelling, and accessibility for interactive design. Your second professor is, I said professor because we have all professors here, but your second presenter is Ken Thompson. He is an assistant professor in residence of digital media and design at Uconn as well, and head of the university's game design program. He has extensive experience in the professional game design and publishing industry, and he is currently the lead developer on Courtroom 600, a virtual reality experience centered on the histories and legacies of the Holocaust. He teaches courses like Intro to Games, Multiplayer Game Design, and the Graduate Student Critique. Your final presenter in this block is James Coltrain. James is an assistant professor of digital media and design and history at Uconn. He's especially interested in the act of historical storytelling through gaming and recently published Black Haven, a first-person narrative experience where players take the role of a young intern named Kendra Turner to understand the history of a sprawling 18th century colonial estate burned by the British during the American Revolution. He teaches courses like modeling for games and 3D virtual worlds. So please help me welcome to the virtual stage with the talk, A Degree in Game Design, Stephen Slota, Ken Thompson, and James Coltrain.
Yay, thank you for your virtual applause. We're really happy to be here with all of you. And we were excited to kind of be asked to present for this conference because it's not often that we get an opportunity to talk a lot about board games or the way that we use board games. Often people are super interested in like, how do you make a video game? And that's part of what we do. But I would say that all 3 of us have some experience in working in paper format or board game format, analog format. And we're going to do a little bit to introduce to you what we do at Uconn and how we think about game design and why it might be valuable to get a degree in game design if this is something you're really passionate about. So hopefully you can see the slides that I'm presenting here. Again, very briefly to introduce us all, I'm Stephen Slota. I'm an assistant professor in residence of Ed Tech at Uconn. And my background is actually, I would say all 3 of our backgrounds are pretty diverse in terms of how we came to games. And that's kind of a statement on how diverse the array of opportunities are in the realm of game design itself. I was originally a teacher. Actually, prior to that, I was a genetic engineer who became a teacher, who then went back to grad school to become a psychologist. And that's where I found that I really loved working with games, that I wanted to understand how they worked and use them as a mechanism for understanding philosophy and complex systems. So I ended up doing some indie board game design and then came around to doing that as a professional opportunity when I moved from healthcare essentially over to teaching at the university's schools of education and fine arts. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Ken Thompson to talk a little bit about his experiences in industry.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Ken, and I worked out in Seattle as well as upstate New York as a video game designer. I worked on a lot of movie tie-in video games and kind of commercial work, and that was really engaging. And one of the things that I think everyone kind of takes for granted is that digital games are completely digital. And in fact, a lot of times we're prototyping. My colleagues and maybe someone who you've actually maybe spoken to Flying Frog Productions, which makes some really good board games like Fortune of Glory. They are also game developers, and I worked with them. Board game development is something that you do, and cards as well, to prototype situations. And it's a necessary skill set, and it's merely a difference of medium of what it is that you're working with. So, I think it's really amazing that you are all gathered together and are also interested in game development in general. That's about my experience. James, do you want to maybe add anything? Oh, unmute yourself first.
Thank you. I'm James Coltrain, and I also had an interesting path to games. I used to be a history professor, and one of the things that I was interested in was historical art and architecture. And so I learned to do 3D modeling and make like architectural reconstructions of historic sites and buildings and stuff like that. And since I'd always been a gamer, at some point, like I learned to code and just started playing around with little game formats and got so addicted to them that I decided that I wanted to stop being a history professor and be a game design professor. And so I just started at Uconn this year. I'm working on a couple of projects. Steve mentioned one called Blackhaven, which is going to be out in probably, hopefully, a month-ish. If anyone wants to see more about that, you can go to my site, which I'm sure we'll have later, historiated.com. But anybody who is interested in playtesting that early, if you sign up for the mailing list, I'd love to have you. And then in terms of how my video game work connects to board games and physical games, I'm primarily teaching art at Uconn, and so we do stuff in both 3D modeling and 2D art, and a lot of the same principles that we talk about with design and color and balance and composition apply to the design of art in physical games, but particularly with the advent of 3D printing. There's the opportunity to use 3D modeling to create physical assets, even for very small shop games, and so I think there's a lot of cool overlap to talk about there.
That's awesome. Yeah, one of the things I love about our group of people who works in Uconn's game design program is that we all have sort of this varied path to have gotten here. And by virtue of having come from such different backgrounds, we have such different things that we've specialized in and think about. And it's always fun for me to get to talk to other people who are really expert in doing something that I'm completely novice in, because games is one of those spaces where you can have different people whose backgrounds are so varied come together and all be able to contribute something to the team, that everybody has something they can add. And the yes and process is really, really productive as game designers. And actually, I figured this is a good opportunity to kind of move forward a little bit and talk about what we do as a program and how we prepare people to go out into the world and do all kinds of interactive design. So not even just games as you might think of a video game, but as James and Ken were saying, we also do board games, we do card games, other kinds of text-based role-playing games. We've had students that have developed mobile games and virtual reality games. And I'm interested in doing all kinds of different things with different people from different areas of expertise. So if you were to go to the Uconn homepage for the game design program, you'd see a little blurb here that talks about the different facets of what it is to be a game designer. And you'll find that it's actually pretty complicated, that there are a bunch of different ways that you can approach this. And I think of that as being a great thing. There aren't many departments that you can go to in a university where there is this interdisciplinarity. And so we have a business aspect to it. We have the art aspect to it. We have the technical aspect to it. And again, this is something that's pretty rare in college experiences, where you get to dip into all of these different, very interesting, very cool spaces. So what does that entail, or what is that all about? Well, I'm going to first present a little bit with Ken and James on what the program is, and then we're going to focus on some Q&A to allow you to all ask questions. But we figured it would be useful to at least lay a foundation that talks about what is a game design program, what kinds of things would you find in it. And so I tried to break down what we do into 7 categories. These are all, they're not official or anything. This isn't something that's published or that we talk about as part of our plan of study. But when I look at the plan of study for a game design major, these are the kinds of things that I tend to think about or find in that plan of study. There's the technical piece, which I called programming, coding, and making magic happen, because I am not a technical person and don't know how to make that stuff happen. So to me, it looks like magic. It might as well be. There's the artistic aspect where you're designing characters and environments and interfaces and all of the different things that make something visually appealing, aesthetically appealing. I would include music in that category, and as well as several other sensory experiences. There's narrative, which isn't necessarily just about storytelling or world building, but it's certainly one of the things that we spend a lot of time talking about. There's context. So figuring out what kinds of spaces do you want to design for? Is it going to be for a mobile interface, or is it going to be for a controller or a PC or a console, or is it going to be a DS console versus a Switch versus a PS5? All of those different things matter a whole lot, or especially versus AR and VR, alternate reality and virtual reality. We talk a lot about audience. This coming fall, I'll be teaching a course about accessibility and universal design. We're really interested in how we think about audiences or stakeholder groups and how accessible the things that we design are. We prototype a lot. So if you take any one of the games courses, you'll be asked to do these sort of artifact-driven portfolio pieces where you're making a pen and paper version of the thing and then scaling it up to the next tier of maybe making a prototype in a virtual space and then working on building a full game. And I'll share with you some examples of student work that highlight how they've done this process from beginning to end. And then finally, integration, or taking all of these different aspects and weaving them together into something that is sort of a nice holistic experience, that full game. There are a lot of different kinds of games or approaches to game development. So again, it doesn't have to be video games, although it is one thing we talk about. I tried to include some dice and cards here and a pencil to, make it clear that we value things like text-based role-playing, Dungeons and Dragons style tabletop, in addition to doing things like VR. But there are three things that a game design degree can really help you with. The first one is it can help you hone your best practices for development. So if you're working as an indie developer, you can get a lot done just learning through tutorials on YouTube or through web forums or Reddit. But it's not quite the same thing as sort of having a mentor who's able to work with you to really give personalized feedback to the specific kinds of things that you're doing as a designer. That's related to the second piece, which is about a portfolio. So not only are you going through the program to have somebody mentoring you, but you're also working on all of these different things that you construct for your classes. So it gives you a set of deadlines for submitting things. It gives you specific criteria that you have to develop within, just like if you were working for a company. It also helps you develop an understanding of the different constraints that exist in game development. So it's not even just about, you have to do things for class, but you've all heard about crunch before. You've heard about how companies operate in terms of how the different departments of a game development firm work in conjunction or in opposition to one another. There's a real opportunity here to think about how you construct things based on the context in which you operate, which brings us to part three, working collaboratively with other people. So when you get in a room with a team of individuals and you're given this problem of practice, how are you all going to contribute your individual strengths to be able to make the best possible product? So all of those things are sort of pulled together to make what is ultimately a game design program. I figured I would give a really brief highlight of how we tend to think about this. Ken and I have talked pretty extensively about this when we've presented on our virtual reality project, Courtroom 600, but I think it's helpful to anyone who's interested in game design for themselves, just in their friend group or people who are doing indie projects. We tend to think about the pillars of game design as being the same as designing anything else. So whether you're writing a book or you're making a movie or you're making a course for a university, they all have this hierarchical structure where you have sort of this overarching objective with all these nested objectives underneath it. So in a class, you might have different units in a class, and those units are broken into lessons, and every lesson is broken into 2 or 3 activities. The same thing is true of games. The games are designed to teach you in certain ways by having that same hierarchical structure. And at least with respect to the way that I run my courses, we talk about game design as being about the one-to-one alignment of your game objective and your learning objective. So whatever it is you want your player to learn, and it doesn't have to be like content oriented, although I would say that
rocket jump.
Yeah, exactly. Whatever it is that you want somebody to learn, whether it's Mario jumping up and hitting a block to get coins, or it's how do you participate in Stellaris, or how do you play a board game like Monopoly, to pick a bad example. Like how do you learn to do those things? And it turns out that the same principles apply in the development of a good board game that apply to the development of a great movie or a great book. So Some of those principles include actual theories, so like theoretical principles. Again, I have a PhD in educational psychology, so I bring a lot of learning theory into the things that I do. What you see on the screen right here are two models that we work from. One of them is called the Addie model, which is analyze, design, develop, implement, and evaluate. And this cycle keeps going round and round as you evaluate what you're working on. You get feedback from your stakeholders or your audience. You design for them. You get some more feedback. You design some more. You develop this thing, et cetera, et cetera. And specifically for serious games, since that's another one of my areas of expertise, we use the Tpack model, which talks about technological elements of the thing you're designing, pedagogical, which is how you teach the thing, and then content knowledge, which is what is the thing you're trying to teach. And that does apply to Super Mario Brothers or any other video game, right? That you have the technological piece of how do you interact with the environment, with the pedagogical piece of how does the environment respond to you, and the content piece of what is it that you want the learner or the player to actually understand. So we think about this as learning to play and playing to learn. And I pulled some images here from the EdTech program where at Uconn, one of the things that makes the educational technology master's program kind of unique to other universities is that we use game-based instruction for basically everything. The entire program is designed as gamified, to use a phrase. We've also done some pretty extensive research on this stuff. My colleague, Dr. Michael Young, who works with the EdTech program, he and I co-authored with some other folks a meta-analysis of games in education, the first meta-analysis. And we've since gone on to make educational card games, board games. In the middle there, you see the work of my students from last spring where they co-created a series of worlds and then told stories within those worlds. There's also cards against education ethics, and we have cards against engineering ethics, which, as you probably have played Cards Against Humanity before, operates more or less the same way, but it's oriented towards educating you about actual cases in the context of education or engineering to help you understand how those things apply in a real world practice. So if you were to come to Uconn, these are the kinds of classes you would probably take for a game design program. And this is not a complete list. And I'm actually going to ask Ken to jump in a second to maybe talk a little bit about some of the other courses or the plan of study that's associated with this. But we tend to think that there are mainly 4 branches of game design that we can help orient you toward, like game designer, gameplay programmer, serious games designer, or somebody who does production or esports management, those sorts of things. Ken, do you want to add a little bit about sort of courseworks or offerings?
Yeah, absolutely. And also just to touch on something you were saying before, in all these classes, one of the things that is the advantage of going to school is having a community of practice, having the ability to have colleagues who you're going through school with 4 years, or if you're in our MFA program for a 3-year MFA, then, that's a lot of time for you to work with other people. Just like Tolkien, when he wrote his, his trilogy in The Hobbit, he did that with a group of people, a group of writers, and he workshopped things. It wasn't just one day in a cabin. He wrote the whole thing. And so in a lot of these courses, although there's opportunities to adjust your process so that you're working on things that you want to work on. We don't ascribe to produce specifically AAA game developers or whatnot. In fact, part of our MFA program, and we have a couple examples, I think a couple later slides, is full of students doing experimental work. And one specific student, Stefan, he has been creating a board game that's a digital analog hybrid. So he's been using NFC tags, and one of the things he ran into were real world issues about shipping NFC tags in the world of manufacturing mayhem that we've found ourselves in. And it actually kind of messed up his final defense a little bit. He had to change it at the last minute. But those kind of things are the same things you run into in production of board games in general, right? You're up to the last second, and suddenly a supplier drops, and you have to figure out how to get something together in time for your big Kickstarter ship date or whatnot. So throughout these classes, we expect you to have like a general understanding of each practice in game development. There's typically programmers, artists, business people, and designers. And then we ask you to specialize a little bit in each direction. And it all depends on what it is that you want to do and what you want to work on. One senior project that I really am in love with was a mod for Hearts of Iron 4, which I have a feeling there's a lot of overlap with players of Hearts of Iron 4. But it was just a mod, and it was a very popular one. And he worked on it as his senior thesis. So really looking towards that passion and that diversity of thought is very important to us as well. It's something that I think is a little underrated, but bringing different ideas to the table really makes for a better design, which is really one of the values. Because there are YouTube videos. I put a lot of my lectures online because I think that's it's useful. And I think a long time ago that was really the thing that you got out of school. But now you're looking for, or at least I think what we should be offering isn't lecture series. It's really the hands-on play time. Like I take these board games, and although we haven't been doing it, my library in Manchester, which awesome library, has a board game lending library, but also has a big group of people playing in the Manchester area, and like at the portal and all that. And I'll take student board games and I'll bring them over, and people are really nice, and they're into that. So it's really fun to be able to kind of share those experiences.
Yeah, that goes back to the community of practice thing too, where the one thing you don't really have when you're working fully online, just listening to lectures, is that the context of other people is what makes designs happen. Like you were saying about Tolkien, right? None of this stuff happens in a vacuum, and it requires us to be able to test what we're building on other people. James, did you want to mention any of the classes that you teach? I know you mentioned your 2D and 3D art stuff, but do you want to talk a little bit about what you do in those courses?
So we can put kind of a exciting sheen on the type of a programmer art that often comes out of prototypes and stuff like that. I've even had a couple of my students reskin existing games after taking my classes. And right now, the sort of track that you could do if you wanted to do the full arts track is we have 2D art for games, which is exactly what it sounds like. The students that I had this semester finished up by reskinning platformers completely. A couple of them, another of them made tile sets for roguelikes, which are very cool. I do 2 3D art classes where basically I can take students who have no prior experience with 3D, and by the end, some of the most talented of them are making things that you could drop right in a AAA game. Really, really, really high quality stuff, but we also like more stylistic, impressionistic things. And then this fall, I'll be teaching 3D virtual worlds as like a large scale level design, and working with like terrain and vegetation, and water and sky, and kit bashing large urban environments and all that fun stuff. And so, yeah, I mean, I've been very, very impressed. I think that the type of stuff that our students are putting out is at the level of any other game design program in terms of aesthetics. And the other, thing that's a benefit, if you're like, well, I'm an existing artist, why would I want to do that in a game development space? It's because the entire game design process is so interdependent, and so when you're doing concept art, you're not just making a cool character. You're thinking about how is this going to fit over a skeleton rig? How is a modeler going to be able to render the little details? I have this great hairstyle that looks awesome in the drawing that I did, but what does it look when you turn it to the side or a 3-corner view? Like, yeah, how am I going to convert this into 3D space? And because I'm a solo indie dev, I know a little bit of all the other parts of the process, and so I think that we do a really good job of like holistically educating our artists to drop in and meaningfully work with a lot of other talented people.
Yeah, I'd like.
Go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, and also just as far as board games are concerned as well, our track, our Bachelor of Fine Arts, is situated within a department full of other tracks, including animation and graphic design, and those are all very critical skills, especially if board games are a career path. Which, I mean, the board game industry is blowing up. I don't know if you've been talking about that at all in some of the other panels, but like it's been doing really well. And those skills of like how to print stuff and also how to make images that you can print and they don't look crummy. Our print shop in the School of Fine Arts is also tip top. We've been around for so long. We have a lot of really amazing equipment there too. So I just like, as part of our track, I think one really important thing is that there are other parts of the university that you can really take advantage of, including those 3D printers and laser cutters and all the rest, which are really in different areas of the university, including our department. But like there are other places too you can get it.
Yeah, it's pretty much what I was going to say. Was it kind of ties what both of you were saying together, is that the nice thing about our program, that as whenever anyone asks me like what is the difference between UConn's games program versus other universities and how do they all differ from one another, I think it really depends on what are your goals and the kind of experience you want to have. Because you could go to a university that has, a very reputable games program, but their focus is entirely on programming, and then you're walking away without a really thorough understanding of creative writing, which, if you're going to go into a video game space, it is nice to be able to predict what are the things that the writers are going to be thinking about, as James was saying. And I really like the fact that we have such a holistic process that we help people through, that we want them to understand how all the complex systems interact with one another. Some good stuff. So, for example, we do a lot of collaborative problem solving, as we've been talking about. You can see here some images of our students. We also will do talks with guest speakers. So the top middle there is one of my friends at our Rochester Institute of Technology, Trent Hergenrader, and we'll have the entire games community interact. I've actually been trying to do a series this year while we've been fully online, where I invite guest speakers who are completely outside the circle of the University of Connecticut to get more diversity of opinion about how things can work. So we've had conversations about social implications of design, or how you think about the ethics of designing particular kinds of stories. We've talked about world building with Dr. Hergenrader. We've talked about public history and the relationship between design and how you communicate things as historical. So there's a lot of opportunity here to work with other people to problem solve. We play a lot of games, board games. You can see we played Don't Break the Ice a while back. So there is a lot of room for you to be able to come in and experiment and think broadly about what games can or should be with other people who may have very different ideas about those things. This is another place I'm going to ask Ken to jump in a second, but Uconn does have a pretty robust esports team or series of teams. So the university has competed in championships in the past, and we actually have some research happening at the university related to esports, including later tonight, there's a virtual panel for the Eastern Forum for Esports Coaching and Teaching. So we're trying to find opportunities to bring in educators from K through 16, so that's K-12 plus colleges, to connect them with players, with organizations, with Able Gamers, which is a charity that works to make games more accessible. We're trying to communicate among all of those different constituencies to get them interacting with one another. And this is in the context of our graduate students in the School of Education actually studying how esports can be used in a classroom. So one of our graduate students, Andrew Cochran, his entire dissertation is about League of Legends and its use as a community of practice to understand how different classroom environments can be run, and how things like science, technology, engineering, and math can be woven into League of Legends and vice versa, how you can use esports to help teach some of those things. Ken, did you want to talk a little bit about your experiences with the esports at UConn?
Yeah, well, one of the things is this year the Rocket League team won the Big East Conference. Yay! So that was really awesome. And yeah, our community here at UConn is quite large. We have a very robust, even during the online times, as I sometimes call them, there's always about 100 or 200 people playing per week. The Discord server has like 1,000 people in it. So there's just a very big community of game players and people who really enjoy both competitive and also the community building aspects of esports and just gaming in general. It's a wonderful program that's mostly run through the student club system, which allows you to kind of spin up a club at any time. And the picture on the bottom is the Heroes of the Dorm competition, which that was the second year that they got in the semifinals. They were second, which means that they only got full-size gaming towers and flights out to Seattle to compete. They did not get a 4-year scholarship, unfortunately, but there will be other prizes in the future. And yeah, the ability to play and also just test out your experiences and having that community is just, it's really great. Something that we're really proud of, and also just our approach and thought, or with our thinking towards esports, and like our invitation of like the Twitch Jimmy Tang. He's a chief financial CFA of Twitch, and it was really awesome to have him come in as well and talk as a Uconn alum. So yeah.
I'm going to go through a couple of projects that we're working on to kind of give examples of the things that we're doing as an institution, because I think one of the things when people think about universities, or they think about education and games in the same sentence, is that, oh, those two things mean like Math Blaster, like you guys make Math Blaster, or you make Oregon Trail, or whatever your idea of a bad educational game is. I don't know, but we actually have been trying to break the mold for what you would traditionally think game studios look like versus educational organizations, and that there are these spaces that exist in between them. And one of the nice things about being an interdisciplinary space like this is that we get a bunch of very talented artists and very talented programmers and very talented storytellers and educators thinking about all of their areas of expertise and how they can potentially put them all together into something really cool. So in my little introduction at the very beginning, we mentioned EOS 503, which is a game that I've been working on over the last year with another one of our graduate students and several undergraduates, and several of whom just graduated this past May, who came together to basically solve the problem of how do you teach teachers these things that are really important in a way that isn't condescending or patronizing, but also reflects what the job of an educator is actually supposed to be. And so in this game, you're on a space station or in these series of biodomes in space, and your job is to be a fixer, or somebody who goes around the space station helping people solve their problems. And you can kind of see in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a dialogue system in which you choose how to respond to particular individuals on the space station, and it's your job to convince them to take a point of view. And so really what we're doing to maintain that like one-to-one principle between the game objective and the learning objective is to put you into a role-playing experience, sort of like what you might experience in like a Telltale game, where there are some branching dialogue paths and you have agency within the context of the game. The difference is that there actually is a meaningful outcome difference, where you have all of your successes or failures accumulate as point values, and those are unseen point values that indicate your influence over different individuals. In the latter half of the game, you can spend that influence to change the way that the space station operates. You essentially build up credibility within the system and then can use that credibility to change the system, which is the kinds of things we want teachers to be thinking about. Another one of the projects that we work on, and I'm going to hand this to Ken since he's the PI on it, is called Courtroom 600. And as you can see in the photo, I'm a participant on this, as well as Ken as our PI and another of our colleagues, Clarissa Seglio. Do you want to run people through it real quick?
Yeah, just briefly, the work that I'm doing here is about dealing with difficult topics in history. And as a game developer, I was really excited to work on a lot of topics, but at some point, I felt that I wanted to use the skill set that I've learned in order to address something that I felt was kind of lacking in the video game industry, and for good reason. There's a lot of difficulties, or there's a lot of challenges in dealing with these kind of histories. So, Courtroom 600 is a project where we're interacting with archival material that was actually is part of the archives here at the University of Connecticut, as well as from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and other places. And we're, through an interactive narrative, addressing and working through some of the histories of what happened, and hopefully doing it in a way that's engaging. I wouldn't say fun necessarily, but in one that is compelling, so that and something that you come away with is kind of, for us, something that we feel has been a long time coming. And with virtual reality projects like The Last Goodbye and the Anne Frank House, which are both on the Oculus Rift store, those are both very serious very serious VR projects that are working with the same kind of histories. So this is just kind of something that I wanted to do, and something that you can do in academia. And one thing you should all know is that's one of the wonderful things about being in school is you get, there might be an assignment, but I think most faculty members will let you adjust it if you really have a passion for something. And they don't let you do that in the industry. They want you to make, I had a friend of mine who worked on a sports game, and he was a 3D modeler for left arms. And that was it. Oh, there's a difference between industry and school. And so take advantage of it. If you are in school or planning to go into school, take advantage, do the things you love. Don't copy, because you'll be told to do that later. It's just like everyone's going to want you to do a clone of like Shadow Complex or whatever it is, the new game at the time. So
great. And I'm going to jump next to James, since I had included your projects as well. I figured you'd want to talk a little bit about how that relates to the broader program and how you think about these things fitting into sort of the courses we teach, or you're thinking about teaching and learning in a game design program.
Yeah, absolutely. My research is as an indie solo developer, and I have a couple of projects. So the first one you can see in the upper left is Cassius, and this is a game about an escaped slave who is taking shelter in a giant plantation complex that's been evacuated during the American Revolution. And so as you kind of explore during that night, you learn about not only the kind of Jeffersonian type family that lives here, but also the many more hundreds of enslaved people who have been forced to work on the plantation. And it's a way to kind of talk about the legacy of slavery as it relates to the founding fathers. And then as a kind of teaser prequel for that, I'm also just finishing a game called Blackhaven. I guess it's actually a sequel, but this takes place at the modern day museum on the same plantation as in Cassius. And you play as a summer intern from a historically Black college who's stuck there over the summer, and she begins digging and finding a lot of sketchy things about the way in which the museum has represented American history, and ultimately ends up kind of making some discoveries that are going to mix things up and contribute to the local Black community. And Blackhaven was done in conjunction with faculty and students at Xavier University of Louisiana, which is the HBCU in New Orleans. And so in terms of like how these impact my teaching and my place in the program, obviously like there's a lot of visual emphasis on these games. And so that's part of my art teaching. But also, since I do every single thing on each of these games, I know a little bit about all of the pipeline. And a thing that's of particular interest to me is because, both of these games are historical fiction, but they draw really, really, really heavily on actual historical documents and resources. I've been to these places in Virginia. I've had a fellowship at Colonial Williamsburg. And so one of the things that I like to emphasize, which of course is just as relevant for board game designers, is looking at real world analogs and closely studying history, not only for things that are obvious like social themes and big story narratives, but even for aesthetics. We don't, you look around some of the most popular sci-fi and fantasy franchises, whether that's Star Wars or Game of Thrones, the amount that they are drawing from real world history and society aesthetics to create things that people think of as very fantastic and otherworldly is really, really high. And I think that that I'm somebody who, even if you don't want to do anything grounded in reality, or you want to do things that are really, really, really out there, there's still a big benefit in going into history and world cultures and picking out things to make a truly rich experience for your players.
Speaking of making truly rich experiences, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit and share some of the student projects that we have. I wanted to share these in particular because I think it gives a good sense of the kinds of things that students are able to produce when they go through the program. So I'm going to go in kind of chronological order, but first is Novuswarm, which Patrick Belanger was the creator of. He was an MFA student, one of Ken's students, and it is a multiplayer virtual reality / couch co-op PvP experience. Do you want to try and describe it, Ken, since you've had some hands-on experience?
So think about it as one giant mothership, which is controlled by the virtual reality player, where the mothership is the controller and can shoot in any direction. And then we have 4 players using video game controllers that are in the it plays a lot like Star Fox 64 did, with kind of that grid view. And the 4 players that are using controllers are the ones that are trying to fight the big mothership in the virtual reality headset. And it's really fun because for one player, it's very physical, and it's very much like a bullet hell kind of game as well. So it was really a great project to see and play.
Yeah, I picked these two because they were both kind of representative of the experimental nature of things that we've been talking about. So Novuswarm being a hybrid between controller play and the VR play. Auto Combat by Stefan Lopezansky is basically modeled off of Auto Chess, if you're familiar with it. And this is an interesting example because of the fact that he wanted it to be a physical digital hybrid. So you can see there's a sort of a I wouldn't call it prototypical, but it's a reference image that he created to showcase what he anticipated he would do with this project. And so ultimately, Ken had mentioned using either I don't remember exactly the mechanisms. QR codes. Yeah, I couldn't remember if it was QR codes or something else, but he ended up with QR codes to deal with all the issues associated with creating the cards. But the goal was to have a phone that would set inside this tray, and that the cards you played would actually affect the things that happen on the phone, sort of like the new Return to Dark Tower game that's being released. Let's see. I'm going to go to the next one. These are 2 other Masters of Fine Arts projects. The first one on the left is Mithrin, which just recently successfully funded a Kickstarter. And that is a Pokemon-like game in which you are training and bonding with these different characters called Mithrin. They battle one another. You bring resources to them, and you get to know them over time. Again, that was one of our graduates from last year last year or the year before? Last year. And so if you're interested in that one, there is a Kickstarter for it as well that just funded, and I think they've just been posting information about that since it was very recent. The other one was a student who just graduated this past month named Emma Atkinson, who's an MFA, who created a virtual reality experience called When We Were, in which you are moving around this shared apartment space after it's been moved out of or is in the process of being moved out of, and you can experience these conversations between 2 sisters who had lived together. Do you want to add anything else to that, Ken? To either of them?
No, I don't think so. I mean, like, I think that they're great projects, and I miss them. I think that is definitely an example. Not the only projects, and we've only been around for 7 years, so we're really proud of the people who've been making projects and coming with us. As a slight side note, Digital Media Design program also offers a funded MFA. All these students are paid to come to the university, and we pay their tuition so that they can. I basically say, if you wanted to go indie and you wanted to go work at a place, would you rather go work at a school teaching games as your TA-ship or something else? So it was really great working with everyone, and that's one of the aspects of our program that is really important to us. So
yeah, that's a great point. I had forgotten to mention the fact that the MFAs are funded. In addition to MFAs, we do have bachelors as well. These are 2 of my honor students who graduated this a few weeks ago, Mackenzie Fox and Devin Quinn. Mackenzie had created a narrative game about depersonalization and derealization. So her game is serious in the sense that it's about mental health, and she's an artist. So she did all of the drawing herself. I worked very closely with her on how she was going to make this representative of actually having depersonalization or derealization and how to cope with it. So the game is about coping strategies to deal with anxiety, depression, etc. And the second one there is Hair Apparent, which is Devin Quinn, who's a programmer. And essentially, he created this political thriller or political social elimination game in which these kingdoms have to decide who's going to be the ruler of the entire continent. And it's your job to figure out who you trust and who you distrust, and then convince them to vote your way to make sure that you end up not being the one who's eliminated. So it's based on those old reality shows like Survivor and Big Brother, that sort of thing. I'm very, very proud of both of them. They did an excellent job. And again, these are undergraduates who did this. So if you went through the game design program, it's very possible that you could create something like this for yourself. And I would love to see more physical analog style games. I know that there was a project that's we've been talking about that had to do with the School of Puppetry, which Uconn has a School of Puppetry. It's one of very few programs in the United States that
PhD.
does that. What's that?
Yeah, graduate degree in puppetry, in fact. So
yeah, so like that's the kind of stuff I'm anxious to see more of. Is like, can we come up with more interesting hybrid experiences that are both digital and physical? There have been a couple great projected art projects that students have come up with. They're not specifically in the game design program. And although I didn't mention them in this slideshow, we do have several MFAs that are doing awesome things right now. One of them is doing a project about PTSD that's set in VR. And we just recently had some other graduates, one of whom did an entire game about cooking and cultural experiences. She's from China originally and wanted to share with Western society, Western culture, her family's heritage of food preparation, the kinds of things that they like to cook for one another. So some really, really cool stuff happening overall.
Yeah, and yeah, when they apply to, a lot of times, depending on if you're a bachelor or an undergraduate or graduate, the one thing I wanted to add was also the application process. We love board games. We love all our students, but board games as well is a totally acceptable and wonderful way to submit. Or if you have like sometimes people submit their D&D campaigns that they wrote, things of that nature. Those are amazing. And one of the things I love about board games is it's accessible to everyone. No matter how much money you have, no matter what kind of schools you went to, everyone can submit paper rules books. So.
Yeah, that's a great point too. I actually, this past semester with my interactive storytelling class, had several people whose final project was they just created a D&D campaign for their friends. Like that's a totally valid reason to do it, because you can still practice storytelling principles in the context of writing for your friend's D&D campaign. So there are a lot of really cool opportunities to have people weave in the things they're passionate about, regardless of what interface you use. And again, like I think the best part of getting a degree in game design is the community of practice. It's being around other people who are thinking about these things, who want to solve these problems, who have interesting problems of their own they want to tackle. I have students who have come from the School of Business, from computer science, from special education, all of whom have a bunch of different ideas. And then I'm now in the process of trying to figure out how do I coordinate all these people, because they all have cool stuff they're doing.
Yeah. So what's everyone else's ideas?
Yeah, we've arrived at the point where we'd hoped we would get to, where we could just listen to all of you, or at least respond to the things that you're curious about.
All right. Well, we definitely have some questions that came in for you guys. It sounds like you guys are really cooking it up over there at Uconn, like so many ideas brewing. But the first question is from Thomas, and he wants to have each of you guys answer this one. Here's a question for each of you. What is one board game that you constantly mention in your lectures because there's so much to learn from it?
I'll take that. Betrayal and House on the Hill. Every single student I have plays that game with me, mostly so that I can finally get through every scenario, because it's a lot.
All right. And actually, they wanted to hear from each one of you guys. What do you guys say?
James, do you have one off the top of your head?
Muted.
I'm still thinking.
Tell us again.
I don't know about every class, but I'm very interested in like historical instances of board games. So like I've talked about Senet, which is the Egyptian very, very early board game, which we still don't know exactly how it works, but we think we have a pretty good idea. And then something that I did for a puzzle in Cassius was look at 18th century board games, and some of which circulated really quickly because they were mass printed, and they have very kind of familiar kind of like, game of life paths that you go around in a twisty path. And so I think it's really cool to just think about our whole human history of physical gaming.
That's a good one. I was buying time. I think Flux is the one I would go to. Flux, and when I teach game systems design, we do a different board game every week. So, or at least a different series of games that are matched to the topic. And so I do a whole week on just mechanics or rule sets. And so Flux is really useful because you want to teach people about dynamic rule sets and how they build up and deconstruct. So that's probably my go-to. Right. I also love the Great Dalmuti, but that's not something I use in class.
Oh, well, why not?
I guess there's space for it. I should find a way to incorporate it.
If you love it, they'll learn a lot from it, probably. All right. Well, here we have another question from Thomas. From what I understand, board game education at universities is very obscure, but I want it to grow. Is there any hope for the future?
I think so. I know this has been a contentious discussion at different programs or different universities. So some of them that are very oriented toward the technical side of game development don't spend a lot of time on board games, card games, experimental stuff, because that's not what they're doing. Like, their goal is not to produce, the best experimental board games in their students. Their goal is to produce programmers who can go work at AAA companies. So like, it really does depend on the kind of thing you want to do. I think, Ken, you were saying it earlier that if you want to go be the artist for the left arm on the character, and I think about this all the time. Like, I've never worked for industry, so all of my jobs have been publicly facing or public oriented. So I've gotten the opportunity to sort of steer my own course in that way. And I've wondered, like, would I feel better if I worked at Nintendo and worked on a Mario game and only did one thing in the Mario game, but could say, like, I made Mario's hat. Like, that's what I did. Or is it better to kind of have the complete agency to decide what is the thing I'm most passionate about and then do that thing, even if it's not with the budget that I might get if I worked at a place like Nintendo? So there are some trade-offs, but that's how I tend to think about it. Do either of you guys have anything you want to add?
I mean, I think that game education is fairly friendly to board games in some cases, because some of the people on the periphery of the technical stuff are kind of scared to become programmers, and so they are drawn to board games at faculty. But I look at what's arguably the behemoth in game design programs at Southern Cal, and I think they have most of their students do board games to start out, and so I do think that it's something that gets a fair amount of attention. And of course, I think Steve mentioned, like, regardless of what kind of game you're interested in, physically prototyping things just is that's something that's useful for everybody. I taught when I was still at Nebraska as a history professor. We made a very small 3D video game that was like a resource management game for nurses in World War II. And to see how that would work, and like the feelings of stress, we had everybody line up around the room and pretend to be like a patient in a bed who was like flagging the nurse, and then had somebody run around as the nurse and try to attend to all of them to try to like balance the pace of like how quick the alerts should go and stuff like that in the game. And so yeah, and even just there's a lot of interaction between play and physical games and digital games, all the way down to just all the real life references that animators use. Lots of them keep mirrors by their desks and stuff like that to act things out before they put them to frame. So yeah, I think it's actually a pretty healthy environment. And I think, like Ken mentioned, just the kind of boom in board games lately, and the small scale fabrication and the indie market, I think, has made them a lot more commercially viable than maybe they would have been a few years ago. And so it's an exciting time for that.
Yeah, very true. Okay, I have time for maybe two more questions. We have one here from Mahesa Akbar. Is there any particular journal in which there are some research articles that you would refer to a beginner board game designer?
That's a great question. So there are a couple different places I would point you to. There are organizations. So there's the Playful Learning Alliance, which is on Facebook. That is it's a closed group, I think, but there are a bunch of educators or academics who do this sort of thing. And I will say that is one thing I enjoy about being in this field as well, is there are academic conferences where you just go play board games with other professors who nerd out about board games. One of my favorite conferences that unfortunately no longer exists was at UW-Madison, called the Games, Learning, and Society Conference. And essentially you would just go in the morning, you'd do some talks, some panels, and then in the afternoon you'd sit at there was an open bar, and you would just go sit and play board games on the patio with people all night. And there's a lot of cool opportunities for that sort of thing. In terms of resources, the RER, the Review of Educational Research paper I mentioned, is a pretty good starting point, the meta-analysis. It's called Our Princesses in Another Castle. So if you search for that plus Young and Slota, that it should show up. There is also James Paul G is sort of the grandfather in education and games. He's He was a linguist who came into doing game stuff because his son was growing up, and as he was playing video games, he went, "Hey, there's probably some cool things I can learn from this about literacy," and it turned out there was. So Jane McGonigal has written about games in the past as well. So her book Reality is Broken. And I think those are probably the big ones. There's also the Higher Education Video Game Alliance, HEVGA, which is a really good set of resources. Can you think of any, either of you?
I don't know about scholarly stuff because I'm pretty new to game studies, but the one thing I would encourage anybody to do is look on YouTube at both the official channels for GDC, the Game Developers Conference, and for Indiecade, where they have a lot of archived talks, many of which are from academics and touch on game studies stuff. And I've learned a tremendous amount. They don't even have all of their talks on there free, but they each have hundreds of them from various years. And for physical and board games and things like that, they don't go out of date as quickly as like some of the ones on rendering or whatever. So I would look at that library. There's a ton of knowledge in both of those YouTube channels.
Wow, that's actually go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say the local conference where you have board game developers, like we have Elm City Games down here in New Haven that has a board game collective. The places where board game developers are, that's your papers. I think board games in general are experiential as well. And so you go to PAX, you go to Dragon Con, you go places where there are developers who are showcasing their work, and you talk to them because oftentimes they are the developer who made it and they're looking for feedback.
That's a great point, and I'll plug CT Fig here too because
excuse me, I forgot.
When I'm wearing my other hat, I do educational games outside of this, I actually have helped sponsor CT Fig in the past, and so I always have a table there, and that is one of the best things about it is getting to play with people the thing that I've designed, so that I can either refine the thing that I'm working on or just have the fun of telling them about this cool thing that I did. And so, I think that's a great point. And the other YouTube resource, I don't know why I didn't mention this, but I'll plug it too, is Game Maker's Toolkit. So there's just some excellent videos on that series. And there are a bunch of other great YouTube series as well. Like I use Crash Course all the time for a variety of different reasons, not even just specifically the games one, but like all of them are great. And so I would definitely recommend going to those for a little bit lighter than like the official white paper stuff.
That's great. Actually, well, you mentioned CT Fig. I just have to plug out here. Which Game First is running CT Fig this year? So we'll be talking to you after the show. Oh man, we're so happy to be out there again. But last, I think I'll get one more question in here, and then also I would ask you guys to, if you could try to get some of those things that you mentioned, help us get them into our resources page because people would really love to look into that stuff. But we have one by Neil McCormick here. He just wants to know what proportion of your graduates go on to have their game designs published.
I don't know the exact answer or percentage to that. I mean, I guess it depends on what you mean by published, but Ken, do you have some thoughts about how you would define it?
Yeah, so our program is about 7 years old, so our graduates there's so many of them. However, the students that are using their work are generally using it to move towards, it's a portfolio piece in a larger work, unless we're talking about Mithrin, which is he's going for it all the way. And so it just depends on the kind of project that you're working on. The students that are doing these projects are getting employed. For instance, Patrick, he works at World Walker Games, which makes this wonderful turn-based strategy game I really love. So it's our MFA students are getting hired. Our bachelors are also getting hired or moving on to graduate school.
All right. I wish we could keep talking about this all day. I personally would have a million questions for you guys too. But we are out of time. We've got to move on to our next segment very soon. But thank you guys very much. Grant?
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah. How about another round of applause, everybody, for Stephen Slota and Ken Thompson and James Coltrain. All right. I want to see those claps in the chat. All right. Clap it up. Thank you, seriously, though, everybody, for taking the time and lending your thoughts and your expertise. I didn't even know you could get a degree in game design. So this was really interesting for me. It's really cool that exists and that people are thinking about the theory and creating stuff. And I don't know, I'm stoked about it. Keep up the good work. UConn is the place to be if you like games.